I moved out, now my fiancé and his mom are desperate. Am I the villain? Never imagined that one day leaving the house I'd shared with my fiancé and his ever-present mother would feel like an act of betrayal until that full morning. I woke up with a weight in my chest, the kind that feels like every decision I ever made was leading to this inevitable moment. It had been months of simmering tension and silent argument, where every conversation turned into a battle of will. My fiancé, Daniel, had always been caught in the middle of his mother's overbearing influence and my desperate need for independence. I had tried, time and again, to carve out a small space for myself, to be seen as an individual with my own dreams and desires. But every attempt seemed to be met with disapproval and condescension, as if my very existence was a challenge to the carefully maintained dynamic of their little world. The decision to move out wasn't made in haste. I spent sleepless nights weighing my feelings, scribbling down lists of pros and cons, and even seeking advice from a few close friends who had seen me struggle with the constant pressure at home. The more I analyzed, the more I realized that I was suffocating in an environment where every step I took was scrutinized. Daniel's mother had always been an omnipresent force. Her opinions, her criticisms, and her unyielding control over every aspect of our daily life. And while I loved Daniel deeply, I felt like I was slowly losing myself under her shadow. The breaking point came one rainy evening when a minor disagreement escalated into a shouting match that left me both physically trembling and emotionally drained. I knew then that I could no longer compromise my identity for the sake of preserving a dysfunctional. With a heavy heart and a battered suitcase, I packed my belongings and left that very night. I remember the cold wind as I stepped out into the darkness, a stark contrast to the turmoil burning inside me. Every step away from that house felt like an act of defiance, a refusal to be molded into someone I was. But as the city lights blurred past in my rearview mirror, a creeping doubt began to settle in. Was I really doing the right thing? The more I questioned, the heavier the burden of guilt grew, especially when I recalled the tearful pleas from Daniel that morning. His eyes were a mix of desperation and confusion, pleading for me to reconsider. And then there was his mother, whose subtle yet piercing glare seemed to say, "How dare you abandon the only family you'll ever have?" The solitude of my new apartment, the silence was deafening. I spent the first few days locked away, oscillating between moments of relief and bouts of overwhelming loneliness. I had expected the freedom to be exhilarating, but instead, I found myself haunted by memories of happier times, when laughter filled the rooms we once shared and love, albeit complicated, bound us together. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see Daniel's gentle smile, and I wondered if my decision had pushed him away forever. The apartment, with its bare walls and unfamiliar corners, felt like a blank canvas upon which I could rewrite my story, yet it was also a constant reminder of the life I'd left behind. As the days turned into weeks, phone calls from Daniel and his mother became more and more desperate. Their voices, laden with sorrow and anger, echoed in the quiet spaces of my new home. Daniel would call at odd hours, his tone pleading as if he were begging me to come back, promising that things would change, that boundaries would be respected. His mother's calls, on the other hand, were a relentless barrage of guilt and reproach, her words twisting into a litany of accusations that made me question if I was the villain in our shared story. The more I listened, the more I wondered if leaving had been the selfish act I had feared it might. Amidst the storm of conflicting emotions, I found a strange sense of liberation. I began to reclaim the parts of myself that had been stifled by constant criticism. I decorated my space with items that spoke of my own dream, a bookshelf filled with novels that had inspired me, a small painting I'd done years ago, and a journal where I now recorded my thoughts with unburdened honesty. Each day was a battle, a constant negotiation between the pain of loss and the promise of newfound freedom. I started taking long walks around the city, allowing the rhythm of my footsteps to drown out the persistent doubts that whispered I might have been too hasty, too self-centered in my bid for autonomy. Now, as I sit in the quiet of the early morning, watching the sunrise paint the sky with muted shades of hope and regret, I am forced to confront the lingering question: am I the villain in this fractured family saga? The answer remains as elusive as ever, a tangled web of love, resentment, and the desperate need to be seen for who I truly am. In this delicate balance between isolation and liberation, I know that the journey ahead will demand more than just physical distance. It will require a deep reckoning with the choices I've made and the scars that they have left behind. And so, with trembling resolve and an uncertain heart, I brace myself for the challenges yet to come, knowing that the truth of my own story can only be uncovered in the quiet moments between despair and hope. The days after I left that suffocating house, every moment in my new apartment felt like a collision between liberation and loneliness. The freedom I had craved was here, tangible in the quiet corners of my new space, yet it came with an unexpected heaviness that weighed on me like a dense fog. I spent the first few mornings wandering the bare rooms of my apartment, letting the silence speak for itself. There was no one to judge my every move, no unsolicited advice on how to live my life, but that silence was as deafening as the constant voices that had once dictated my every step. I set up my small haven with care, arranging my few cherished belongings on shelves and walls, trying to make the space a true reflection of who I wanted to be, free, authentic, and unburdened by expectation. Yet even as I decorated my new home with with items that resonated with my personal journey, photos of sunsets, mementos from long-forgotten adventures, and books that once whispered promises of change. Each object seemed to echo memories of the past I had left behind. My phone never stopped buzzing with messages from Daniel and his mother, each text laden with a mixture of desperation, regret, and a piercing accusation that I had abandoned my responsibility. Daniel's messages were the most frequent. His pleas came in the early hours of the morning, sometimes in a hurried tone, sometimes filled with tender longing that made my heart ache. "Please call me," he would text. "I just need to understand." Each message tugged at me, stirring up the emotions I had tried so hard to bury. Was my act of leaving the very thing that severed the only thread that bound us together? Questioned myself over and over again. During long, restless nights, I would lie in bed listening to the distant hum of the city, my mind racing with what-ifs and maybe. I replayed the argument that had led me to walk out that rainy evening, the heated words, the tearful faces, the silent, accusing look. I thought about the sacrifices I had made and the boundaries I had tried to set, wondering if those very boundaries had turned me into the villain in their eye. At times, guilt would creep in like an unwelcome guest, whispering that maybe I had been too rash, too self-centered. But then, when I looked around my new apartment, the stark emptiness underscored the price I had paid for autonomy. Seeking solace, I started venturing out into the city. Long walks became my escape, and I frequented a small park where the trees swayed with the secrets of the wind. In those moments, surrounded by the natural rhythm of life, I allowed myself to grieve what I had lost while also celebrating what I had gained, a life unshackled from constant scrutiny. Yet even the park couldn't entirely mask the heaviness in my heart. I'd often sit on a weathered bench, watching couples and families pass by, feeling simultaneously a part of the world and detached. I longed to hear Daniel's laugh, to feel the warmth of his embrace, but the distance between us was growing wider with every passing day. One afternoon, I met an old friend at a quiet cafe, hoping to find clarity in conversation. Over cups of steaming tea, I recounted my experiences. The overwhelming sense of relief mingled with the sting of abandonment. My friend listened intently, her eyes soft with understanding, but she also asked the hard question. "Do you think you might be running away from something too?" she asked gently. Her words struck a chord deep within me, forcing me to confront the possibility that my departure was not just about escaping overbearing control, but perhaps also about evading the inevitable confrontation with my own vulnerability. I realized that I had been so focused on the oppressive presence of Daniel's mother, and even on Daniel's indecision, that I hadn't fully explored what I truly needed. Was it freedom I sought, or was it a way to finally find my own voice in a conversation that had long been dominated by others? Back in the solitude of my apartment that evening, I sat at my small kitchen table and opened a fresh journal. I began to write, pouring out the tangled mess of thoughts and emotions that had been building inside me. The act of writing became my nightly ritual, a way to unburden my mind, to trace the origins of my fears, and to slowly, painstakingly carve out a space for my own identity. Each line was a step toward understanding the choices I had made, the sacrifices I had endured, and the hope that perhaps in time I might reconcile the freedom I now enjoyed with the cost it had extracted from my heart. As I closed my journal that night, I couldn't shake the echo of Daniel's last call, a plea that still lingered in the silence of my apartment. I wondered if, somewhere in the midst of all this chaos, there was a way to mend what was broken, or if I was destined to remain the villain in a story that was never truly mine. With the rising dawn peeking through the window, I knew that the journey to answer these questions was only beginning. The weight of freedom was both a burden and a blessing, and as I prepared to face another day, I vowed to keep searching for the truth of who I was meant to be, no matter how painful the path might become. The days that followed my move out became a tangled mix of guilt, uncertainty, and a rising tension that threatened to pull my heart in 100 different directions. Every morning, I awoke to a string of missed calls and messages that seemed to echo my own doubts about leaving. Daniel's voice, laden with a desperate mix of sorrow and anger, haunted my thoughts. He pleaded on the phone, his tone a blend of frustration and hurt that made me wonder if my newfound freedom was worth the growing chasm between us. Meanwhile, his mother's messages were relentless, sharp, accusing, and tinged with an unyielding demand that I return to the fold. It was as if I had become the center of a storm that I neither created nor could control. I spent long hours packing the floor of my new apartment, grappling with the remnants of our past and the uncertain future ahead. Every familiar object in my new space reminded me of the life I had left behind, and with each reminder, the weight of my decision grew heavier. I tried to convince myself that this separation was necessary for my own growth, that escaping the suffocating presence of Daniel's mother and the constant mediation between them was the only way I could reclaim my identity. Yet as I scrolled through his texts and listened to voicemails late at night, I couldn't help feel that I was fracturing the very bonds of love that had once sustained me. One afternoon, overwhelmed by conflicting emotions, I decided to visit a quiet park on the outskirts of the city, a small refuge where I could let my mind wander freely. The park was almost deserted, the crisp air filled with the scent of fallen leaves and distant laughter. I found a secluded bench and sat down, trying to piece together the events that had led me to this critical juncture. I remembered our earlier days together, the soft morning coffees, the gentle reassurance in Daniel's smile, and even the occasional protective touch from his mother that, back then, I had mistaken for affection rather than control. Now, those memories clashed with the bitter reality of isolation and accusation. As I sat lost in thought, my phone buzzed once more. It was a message from Daniel, a simple, desperate, "We need to talk." My heart clenched. I wasn't sure if I was ready for another confrontation, yet a part of me longed to hear him, to understand the pain behind his words. That evening, we arranged to meet at a small, dimly lit cafe that had once been our favorite spot. Walking into the cafe felt like stepping into a time capsule. The familiar hum of conversation, the soft clink of coffee cups, and even the gentle light that bathed the room brought back comfort and heartache. Daniel arrived, the tension was palpable. His eyes, once warm with unguarded affection, now held a storm of emotions, betrayal, longing, and something I couldn't quite place. We sat in silence for a few long moments, the air thick with unspoken words. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice trembling with vulnerability. "I feel abandoned," he confessed, each word a painful admission. "You're leaving, it feels like you're throwing away everything we had." His words cut. I tried to explain my need for space, for a chance to breathe, to rediscover who I was without the constant pressure. But every time I opened my mouth, I sensed the gap widening, a gulf filled with both unresolved hurt and unanswered questions. In the midst of our conversation, his mother unexpectedly called. The intrusion was jarring, a reminder that even in this moment of raw vulnerability, I was not free from their control. Daniel answered, and I heard his mother's stern voice in the background, accusing me of selfishness and ingratitude. The conversation ended abruptly, leaving us both staring at each other in a painful silence. I could see the hurt in Daniel's eyes, and I felt the sting of responsibility for causing this fracture. Was I truly the villain in his eyes, or was I simply fighting for the autonomy I so desperately needed? After that meeting, I walked home under a sky heavy with unresolved storm clouds, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotion. I was caught between the liberation I had longed for and the deep-rooted bonds of love and obligation that still tethered me to a life I wasn't sure I wanted anymore. In the solitude of my apartment, I began to record my thoughts in a journal, trying to untangle the web of feelings that churned within me. I wrote about the pain of leaving, the fear of becoming the villain in someone's story, and the desperate hope that, somehow, I could forge a path that honored both my need for independence and the love I still felt for Daniel. At night, as I lay awake in the quiet dark, I wondered if this painful separation might eventually lead us to a deeper understanding, or if it was a chasm that could never be bridged. The uncertainty was terrifying, yet it was also the spark that ignited my determination to redefine my future on my own terms. With each passing moment, the question echoed relentlessly. Am I the villain, or am I simply a person who dared to seek her own freedom in a world that demands conformity? In the silence between heartbeats, I realized that the answer wasn't clear-cut. It lay hidden in the complex interplay of love, sacrifice, and the human need to be true to oneself. In the quiet aftermath of that fateful cafe meeting, I awoke one morning to a silence so heavy it almost felt suffocating. The echoes of the painful conversation with Daniel still reverberated in my mind. The sting of his accusation, the tearful sorrow in his eyes, and the abrupt intrusion of his mother's commanding voice that had shattered any fragile hope of reconciliation. At night, as I lay in the dim glow of my new apartment, I replayed every word over and over, wondering if I had truly severed the bonds of our past or merely set in motion a chain reaction I couldn't control. The fallout of our confrontation was no longer confined to the cafe. It had seeped into every corner of my existence, leaving me to grapple with a maze of guilt, longing, and an overwhelming need for answers. The day after our meeting, my phone buzzed relentlessly. Daniel's messages came thick and fast, each one a desperate plea for understanding, each one laced with a mix of hurt and anger. "Why did you leave? We need to fix this. I feel like you've abandoned us." I sat at my kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee in hand, and stared at the screen as if it might somehow reveal the secret to undoing the damage. Every beep felt like a reminder of the love I once cherished and the painful distance that now yawned between us. I tried to craft a response that balanced my need for personal space with the lingering affection I still felt for Daniel, but words seemed inadequate to express the turmoil inside me. As the hours passed, the isolation of my new life grew more pronounced. The apartment, which I had envisioned as a sanctuary of freedom, now felt like a cell built of my own doubts and regrets. I wandered from room to room, touching the objects I had carefully chosen to represent my independence. A framed photo of a sunset I'd captured on a solitary trip, a worn-out journal filled with my raw thoughts, even a small potted plant that stubbornly clung to life despite its barren surroundings. Yet each of these items only deepened my awareness of the life I had left behind and the uncertainty of the one I was trying to build. Later that afternoon, a knock at my door startled me. I opened it to find a friend from college, someone who had always been a pillar of strength and clarity. Over a cup of tea in my sparsely furnished living room, we talked for hours. She listened intently as I recounted the events of the past few days, the heart-wrenching conversation at the cafe, the flood of messages, the oppressive silence of my apartment. "You're carrying a lot of pain, but you also deserve to live your life without being held hostage by guilt," she said softly. Her words, though gentle, cut through the fog of my despair and reminded me that I wasn't entirely alone in this struggle. Yet, even as her support provided a temporary balm for my wounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that the damage was already done. That evening, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. I reached out to Daniel and asked if we could meet one more time to talk, this time in a neutral place away from the heavy weight of past argument. We agreed to meet at a quiet park, a place where the chaos of our emotions might be tempered by the calming rhythm of nature. As I walked toward our meeting spot, my mind raced with conflicting thoughts. I recalled the warmth of his embrace from happier days and the way his eyes used to light up when he spoke about our future. But I also remembered the suffocating atmosphere of our old home, the constant interference of his mother, and the growing desperation that had driven me to seek freedom. Under the canopy of ancient trees, we sat on a weathered bench, the autumn leaves crunching beneath our feet. Daniel's face was etched with a vulnerability that made my heart ache. He began tentatively, I miss you, but I also feel lost without you. I don't understand why you felt you had to leave so suddenly." His voice wavered between anger and longing. I took a deep breath and tried to explain. It wasn't about not loving you. It was about finding myself again in a place where I'm not defined by someone else's expectation. Our conversation unfolded slowly, like a delicate dance of words and silences, as we attempted to bridge the chasm that had grown between us. Every sentence was an effort to understand, every pause a moment to reflect on the past and what might be salvaged. By the time dusk crept over the park, I realized that the fallout was far from over. The encounter left us both with more questions than answers. A fragile hope mingled with the reality that some wounds run too deep to be healed with simple words. As we parted ways, I couldn't help but feel that I was at a crossroad. The path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, and I wondered if reclaiming my freedom had come at too steep a price. In that quiet, reflective moment, I knew that the choices I had made were irreversible. I was not the villain in this story, nor was I a martyr. I was simply a person caught in the relentless struggle to be true to myself amidst a web of expectations and unspoken obligation. Walking home alone under a sky painted with the hues of twilight, I felt the weight of each step, each one a reminder that while freedom was a powerful gift, it was also a burden that demanded sacrifice. The fallout from my decision to move out had set in motion a series of events that would reshape the contours of my relationship, forcing me to confront not only the remnants of a shared past, but also the daunting possibility of a future built on uncertain, yet necessary independence. Fragile calm I had begun to carve out in my new life was shattered one rainy evening when my phone rang incessantly, its shrill sound echoing through the nearly empty halls of my apartment. I stared at the screen in disbelief as call after call from Daniel appeared, each one a desperate plea to come home, to talk, to explain. But it wasn't just him. His mother's voice, laced with an edge of anger and sorrow, broke through the static of my isolation. In that moment, the reality of the situation hit me with overwhelming force. The bonds that had once seemed unbreakable were now fraying at the edges, and I was caught in the middle of a conflict I never wished to start. I remember the anxiety that gripped me as I paced around the living room, the rhythmic patter of rain outside mirroring the turbulent beat of my heart. Every message I received was a reminder that my departure had upended a delicate balance, and with it came a cascade of emotions I wasn't entirely prepared for. Daniel's words were a blend of anguish and confusion. "I feel abandoned. Please don't do this to us. You're the only one who can fix this," sent in rapid succession. Meanwhile, his mother's texts were sharp and accusatory, insisting that my leaving was not only selfish, but an act of betrayal against the family that had always depended on her guidance. The weight of their voices pressed down on me, and for the first time since I moved out, I began to wonder if I had truly made the right choice. In the midst of that emotional storm, I found myself sinking into a restless introspection. I recalled moments from our past that once filled me with warmth. The lazy Sunday mornings spent sharing coffee and laughter. The quiet evenings where Daniel's gentle reassurance made the world seem a little less harsh. But those memories were now tainted by the omnipresent interference of his mother, whose controlling nature had slowly eroded the space for me to simply be me. Every flash of a happy memory was juxtaposed with a bitter recollection of overbearing criticism, leaving me with an inescapable question. Was my pursuit of freedom worth the cost of tearing apart something that once had been love? That night, unable to sleep, I wandered out into the rain-soaked street, my mind racing with doubts and regret. The cold drizzle on my skin was both a comfort and a reminder of my isolation. I passed by shuttered storefronts and empty sidewalks, feeling as though the world around me had grown as desolate as my own heart. My thoughts circled around the painful possibility that my decision to leave had become a catalyst for deeper wounds that might never fully heal, no matter how much distance I put between us. The incessant buzzing of my phone, even when I had turned it off, echoed like a distant drumbeat of inevitable confrontation. Later, the tension escalated when Daniel unexpectedly showed up at my doorstep. His eyes were swollen from crying, and the mix of anger and pleading in his gaze left me reeling. He demanded to know why I had left, his voice trembling as he recounted how every day without me felt like a step further into a void of loneliness and despair. In that moment, I could see the raw vulnerability beneath his anger, a vulnerability that mirrored my own. Yet as much as I wanted to reach out and mend the frayed threads of our relationship, a part of me recoiled at the thought of surrendering to the pressure that had pushed me away in the first. I could no longer ignore the necessity of carving out a space where I could reclaim my identity, even if it meant hurting the ones I loved most. As the confrontation unfolded in the narrow entryway of my apartment, his mother arrived as well, her presence filling the space with an almost tangible tension. The three of us stood in a silent standoff, each of us weighed down by our own fears and unspoken accusations. Her words were curt, her tone laced with the conviction that I had betrayed not just Daniel, but the entire family. Questioned my loyalty, demanded explanations that I struggled to provide, and in the process, forced me to confront the full scope of the emotional chaos my departure had incited. Amidst the angry exchanges and tearful pleas, I felt the bitter sting of being labeled the villain in a story that was far more complex than simple right or wrong. Later that evening, after they had finally left and the door closed behind them with a final resounding thud, I sank onto the cold floor of my living room. The silence that followed was deafening, a stark counterpoint to the cacophony of voices that had invaded my space just hours before. I spent a long time there, lost in thought, questioning the choices that had led me to this precarious precipice. Was I running away from the very things that could have ultimately brought us closer together? Or was this painful separation the only way to reclaim a sense of self that had been slowly eroded by constant constant judgment and control. In that quiet aftermath, with the rain still tapping softly on the window, I resolved that the only way forward was to face the fallout head-on. I knew that the road ahead would be fraught with painful conversations, lingering regrets, and the arduous task of rebuilding relationships that had been shattered by my quest for independence. Yet even as I battled the searing guilt and the relentless onslaught of accusation, I found a glimmer of hope, a stubborn belief that, in time, we might all learn to honor our own truths without sacrificing the bonds we once held dear. As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I realized that the confrontation at my doorstep was not an end but a turning point, a moment that demanded difficult choices and the courage to stand by my convictions, even when it meant facing the wrath of those I loved most. And with that thought, I prepared myself for the uncertain journey ahead, determined to navigate the storm of emotions and emerge, if not unscathed, then at least more certain of who I was meant. For weeks now, the tension between my need for independence and the desperate pleas from Daniel and his mother had built into a pressure that felt nearly unbearable. I found myself caught in a liminal space, a chasm where every choice weighed heavily on my heart, and the very air in my new apartment seemed charged with unspoken accusation. I spent long hours packing my living room, the rhythmic tick of the clock echoing the steady pulse of my doubt, as I tried to reconcile my yearning for freedom with the ever-present guilt that I was the source of their misery. At morning, the sun barely crept over the horizon when I received yet another barrage of messages. Daniel's texts were a mix of raw emotion and pleading, interspersed with desperate declarations like, "I can't do this without you," and "Please tell me there's still hope." Each message was a reminder of the intimacy we once shared, a time when his love felt uncomplicated and sincere. In contrast, his mother's messages were laced with cold reproach and thinly veiled threat. One message in particular chilled me to the bone. "You're tearing our family apart, and you'll regret it." The duality of these voices left me spinning, as if I were stranded in a storm where every direction led to conflict. Unable to bear the cacophony of voices any longer, I decided to step outside. I grabbed my jacket and left my apartment, walking aimlessly through the quiet, early morning street. The cool air did little to calm my inner turmoil. Instead, it sharpened the edge of my thought. I recalled the day I left that overbearing house, a day filled with anger and sorrow, but also a glimmer of hope that I might finally reclaim a piece of myself. Yet now that hope felt battered by the relentless wave of regret and responsibility, I couldn't help but wonder if my decision had been rash. Was I, in my pursuit of freedom, abandoning the very person I loved? The question echoed in every step I took, and with each passing block, the weight of uncertainty pressed harder on my chest. In the midst of this inner conflict, I sought refuge in a small, tucked-away coffee shop that I had never visited before. The soft hum of conversation and the rich aroma of freshly ground coffee offered a momentary distraction from my relentless thought. I settled into a quiet corner, pulling out my journal and a pen to try and give form to the chaos inside. As I scribbled down my feelings, I realized that this journal was not just a record of my emotions, but a lifeline, a tool to understand the intricate web of love, duty, and betrayal that had become my reality. I wrote about the conflicting images of Daniel, the tender smile he once wore when we were happy, and the haunted look in his eyes now, filled with hurt and confusion. I detailed the constant barrage of messages, the suffocating presence of his mother's disapproval, and my own desperate attempts to hold onto a semblance of self amid the wreck. The hours slipped by as I lost myself in writing, until the barista gently informed me that it was time to close. Stepping back out into the twilight, I realized that I was at a crossroad. Every instinct in me screamed to fight for my right to independence, yet another part of me ached with the desire to mend the fractures in our relationship. I remembered a time when our family gatherings had been filled with laughter and warmth, a stark contrast to the current state of simmering animosity. Those memories became my compass, guiding me to confront the looming crisis rather than retreating further into solitude. Determined to take a step toward clarity, I dialed Daniel's number. I had to hear his voice, even if it meant risking further pain. When he answered, his voice was subdued, heavy with exhaustion and uncertain. "We need to talk," he said simply, and in that moment every unspoken word between us surged into the conversation. I confessed my fears, my doubts, and my need to be true to myself. I told him that my decision to leave was not an act of rebellion against him, but a necessary step to rediscover the person I had long suppressed. His silence on the other end was deafening, a mixture of sadness and a lingering hope that perhaps, just maybe, we could find a way to rebuild what had been broken. As our conversation drew to a close, I sensed that this call was a turning point, a delicate balance between reconciliation and the painful reality of our new lives. I knew that the storm was far from over. There would be more confrontations, more messages filled with both anguish and love. Yet amid the uncertainty, I felt a small spark of resolve. I was at the tipping point, and the choices I made from now on would define not only the future of our relationship, but also the person I was becoming. Walking back home under a sky painted with hues of deepening dusk, I felt both the ache of isolation and the promise of a new beginning. The road ahead was steep and fraught with the risk of further heartache, but I was determined to navigate it with honesty, compassion, and a commitment to preserving the fragile beauty of my newfound freedom. In that quiet moment, I vowed to face the coming challenges head-on, even if it meant confronting the very people who had once been my world. As the days turned into weeks, The relentless storm of emotions, accusations, and desperate pleas began to settle into a fragile quiet, one that, while not erasing the pain, allowed space for healing and clarity. I found myself at the cusp of a new beginning, standing in a small park at sunrise, the lights soft and hopeful as if the day itself promising redemption. This morning, everything felt. The cold weight of isolation that had plagued my nights was gradually replaced by a cautious warmth. I realized that despite the turmoil and the accusations, I was no longer defined solely by my decision to leave. Instead, I was slowly reclaiming my identity piece by piece. The weeks following our turbulent confrontations, Daniel and I had begun a series of earnest, raw conversation. The bitterness of our previous arguments had been replaced by a tentative dialogue, one where we both laid bare our deepest fears and unmet needs. Daniel, with his eyes still glistening from past tears, admitted that the separation had forced him to confront aspects of himself he had long ignored. I, too, learned to speak of my need for space without the venom of our exchanges, though laced with the scars of betrayal, filled with small, genuine moments of understanding. It was in these moments that I began to see the possibility of forgiveness, not as a means to condone what had happened, but as a pathway toward healing. One particularly poignant meeting in a quiet corner of a local cafe, a neutral ground where memories of our happier times mingled with the sober reality of our present. I sat across from Daniel, his gaze steady and his voice soft with remorse and hope. "I miss us," he whispered, and in that simple statement lay a universe of longing and regret. I responded not with anger, but with the honest admission of my own pain and need for freedom. "I needed to find myself again, Dan. I had to break free from the chains that weighed me down." There was a silence as heavy as the past that hung between us. But then, slowly, we began to build bridges with our words, discussing how we could possibly redefine our relationship in a way that honored both our need for intimacy and our individual autonomy. Parallel to this fragile reconciliation, I also learned to navigate the persistent presence of Daniel's mother, a figure who had, for so long, cast her shadow over every decision we made. At first, her voice was a constant intrusion, a reminder of the old dynamics that I had fought so hard to escape. But as time passed, her relentless calls and texts softened into expressions of worry rather than outright condemnation. In one of our final, earnest conversations, she admitted almost hesitantly that she feared losing control, and with it, the security she believed our family needed. "I was so afraid," she confessed, "afraid that if you left, everything would crumble." Her vulnerability struck me deep. I realized that beneath the layers of harsh words and domineering behavior lay a woman terrified of change. A woman who had, in her own misguided way, acted out of a desperate need to protect what she thought was best. That moment, I began to understand that our conflicts were not born of malice alone, but of a tangled web of fears and unspoken expectation. I reached out with compassion, explaining that my decision to leave was not an act of rebellion against them personally, but a necessary journey to reclaim my own voice. The conversation was difficult and fraught with tension, but it marked a turning point. With time, I saw a gradual thaw in her demeanor, a subtle acceptance that, while she might never fully understand my need for independence, she could at least try to let go of the control that had once defined our home. Now, as I stand here reflecting on this long and winding journey, I am neither a villain nor a martyr, a person who has been irrevocably changed by the choices she was forced to make. I have tasted the bitterness of separation and the sweetness of tentative reconciliation. The pain remains, as do the scars, but they are no longer chains that hold me back. They are the marks of my survival, reminders of the courage it took to stand up for my own well-being. Final reckoning was not a dramatic climax in a courtroom or a grand confrontation on a stormy night. It was instead a series of small, intimate moments, tearful conversation, long silences filled with understanding, and the quiet dawns that followed nights of restless introspection. I have learned that moving forward sometimes means accepting that some relationships will never be the same. It means forging a new path that honors both love and the need for self-determination. As I watch the sunrise over the park, I feel a deep, if tentative. I have begun to rebuild my life piece by piece on a foundation of honesty and newfound strength. The journey ahead is still uncertain, and the echoes of the past will forever remind me of the sacrifices I made. But in that uncertainty, there is also promise, a promise that one day I will look back on these chapters not with regret, but with gratitude for the resilience they forged in me. And as the light of the new day spreads across the horizon, I step forward, determined to embrace the future on my own terms, with an open heart and the courage to love again on my own terms.